Welcome to the deep dive. This is where we take those sources you send our way and, well, we really unpack them. We pull out the key insights, the nuggets of knowledge to help you get informed.
Exactly. Think of us as your guides, really, helping you cut through the noise, see the patterns in the information, and just get straight to what the source material is actually presenting.
And today, we are diving deep into a source that gives a very unique perspective on a reported event. A blackout supposedly happened April 28, 2025. Affected Spain, Portugal, parts of southern France.
Yeah, it's a transcript from a hypnotic regression investigation, and it explores the perceived physical side, the energetic aspects, even the geopolitical dimensions of this blackout, all from the viewpoint of the person in that hypnotic state.
So our mission today is to unpack this source, explore its specific claims, what happened, why it happened according to this perspective, how people supposedly reacted, and, what future stuff might be implied.
And just to be really clear up front, this deep dive is about understanding the story, the details within this specific source. We're exploring this particular viewpoint, not saying whether it's true or not.
Okay, got it. Let's unpack this unique account then. Let's start with the basics. What does the source say physically happened on April 28th, 2025?
Well, the account describes this blackout hitting Spain, Portugal, southern France, like you said. But the key thing on the physical level wasn't that electricity just vanished. It was more like it was sharply interrupted.
Interrupted, okay. Did it feel random or?
No, not random at all, according to the source. The perception was very much like a button has been pushed, deliberate.
A button push. Any analogy given for that feeling?
Yeah, a pretty vivid one, actually. It was like pushing the button for an explosive charge and seeing the meter run backward right before it goes off. That kind of abrupt, deliberate action.
Wow, okay. So that's the what. But what about the why? Why would this button be pushed, according to the source? What was the purpose?
Well, this is where it gets interesting. The source describes it as a test simulation, basically testing.
A test? What were they testing?
The perception was they were testing how people would react, how they'd behave, specifically in these countries, which the source notes are, powerful countries in the EU.
Uh-huh. And the goal of testing their reaction.
So they know next time, that's the phrase used, to see how this played out, how people coped or didn't cope, to decide if they'd, do it again, maybe test it somewhere else, or even prolong it next time.
Okay, now, the source doesn't stop at the physical, does it? It goes into this other layer, the esoteric or metaphysical side. What was the perceived cause from that angle?
Right. From this energetic perspective, the focus was supposedly all about generating energy, specifically emotional energy. The goal was to see just how much emotion, how much energy this kind of event could stir up.
And did it stir up much? Was it significant?
Apparently, yes. The source perceived that the energy produced was actually more potent than energy generated from other so-called events.
More potent. Okay, so if you're generating all this potent emotional energy, how is it collected? Did the source describe that?
It did. It used the metaphor of a fishnet. This energetic fishnet was perceived as being used to gather up all those energies, the fear, the panic, the chaos bubbling up from people.
A fishnet collecting emotions. And who was holding the net, so to speak? Who is perceived as doing the collecting?
The source mentions a congregation or group working together. It specifically names reptilians, draconians as being involved, and the perception was that each entity was getting its own energy, like their share of the harvest.
Reptilians, draconians.
Yeah.
Okay, so if we zoom out a bit, what's the bigger picture here? The blackout, the energy harvesting.
Right.
What's the perceived overall objective?
The core goal presented in this account, to create dependence. The idea is that by stirring up all this chaos and fear, people lose their sense of their own power. They become more reliant on outside forces, like the government.
Dependence leading to.
Obedience, exactly. The underlying message perceived was, you need to listen, you have to obey. The source even summed it up with a phrase like, stay in your cage, you'll be good. Kind of chilling.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, let's shift gears slightly. What about governments? Were they aware this was coming, according to this source?
Yes, the claim is pretty direct. They knew. It was perceived as planned.
And not just the governments of Spain, Portugal, and France, right? Others knew too.
That's right. The source also listed Canada, the USA, and Japan as being in the know.
Interesting. Why would Canada, the US, and Japan need to know about a planned European blackout, according to this narrative?
The perceived reason was so they could potentially replicate it, create the same scenario in their own regions later on. The goal being to potent energy more of the chaos globally, spread it around.
So it's all part of a bigger strategy then.
That's exactly how the source describes it. All connected, part of a global strategy, but with different agendas at play for different countries.
Okay, let's unpack those agendas. What was France's perceived role, being the one who supposedly pushed the button?
France, and Macron was mentioned, was seen as doing it to gain power, achieve sovereignty, basically position itself as the power in Europe. That's one strategy outlined.
Okay. And the USA, what was their perceived angle?
The U.S. was presented as having a sort of hidden agreement with the EU and later specifically linked with France, so maybe looking opposed on the surface but working together under things, using different tactics to create that dependency we talked about. Also perceived as having power over Canada.
Which explains Canada's position.
Yeah, Canada was just perceived as being under the USA. Pretty straightforward.
And Japan's connection?
Japan was linked to using technology. The idea was maybe to help make the event seem more natural, to mask its perceived artificial origins.
Okay, so back to Spain and Portugal where it actually happened. What was their perceived role?
They knew, but they essentially had to obey. The order was perceived as coming from France.
And why would France want Spain and Portugal to obey like that? What's the connection?
Well, the source perceived France as being really connected to the states USA and using that connection to kind of assert dominance and build its power base within Europe. Forcing submission was part of that power play, it seems.
You mentioned France had other strategies too, not just the blackout.
Yeah, there was another angle mentioned, messing with agriculture, possibly causing droughts. Spain's production was specifically mentioned, and framing these things in a way that makes people feel like they're being punished by gods, creating that kind of helplessness.
Wow, quite a web. So how well was this whole complex strategy perceived to be working, say, by early May 2025 in the source's view?
The perception was they were trying very hard, and it was working, but maybe not working the way they wanted. The effectiveness was estimated at about 75% at that point.
Only 75%. Did the source mention anything that could lower that percentage?
Yes. Crucially, it stated that people's growing awareness will decrease this percentage. So people waking up to things was seen as the counterforce.
Okay, let's shift to the people experiencing this, the human side. What did the source perceive happening on a collective consciousness level during the blackout?
It described a dark cloud forming over the affected areas, and this cloud was potented by the energy of the people, like a physical manifestation of all that fear and chaos.
Was this cloud the same everywhere?
No, there was a distinct difference. It was perceived as being much stronger and darker above the cities. Madrid, Barcelona, Lisbon, Paris were named specifically. Less intense in the outskirts or suburbs.
That's fascinating. And how did that translate into individual reactions? You mentioned cities versus outskirts.
Yeah, a really stark contrast according to the source. Outside the cities, people were perceived as very calm. Their main reaction was just, buying candles. Practical.
In the cities?
Oh, totally different energy. It was described as contagious. People felt intense fear, helplessness, uncertainty, just feeling completely powerless.
What were their thoughts like, according to this perception?
It's just chaos. Thousands of things in a second. Survival instinct kicking in hard. Can't reach family, feeling totally disconnected. The source used a really strong image. Their brains felt like electrocuted, just overwhelmed. And that difference was linked to self-sufficiency.
Yeah, the source tied it back to survival instinct and whether people felt self-sustainable versus, more dependent, which was perceived as being more the case in the cities.
And the source saw links between these reactions and things people already believed or had been told.
Absolutely. I mentioned that ideas like the 3 days of darkness or 10 days of darkness popped into people's minds, old prophecies or beliefs getting activated by the event.
And wasn't there a connection to government warnings, too?
Yes, a very specific one. The source perceived a link to government advice about having a 72-hour survival kit, which was reportedly issued exactly 1 month before the blackout.
Ah, the timing. So people thought.
Exactly. Thoughts like, oh, I didn't listen, I should have prepared, I didn't get the kit. That kind of regret, reinforcing the idea that you should have listened to the authorities.
So the perceived objective there was obedience again.
Pretty much. To make people believe whatever they're saying is true. Listen to the government, listen to the media. The source even compared it to the 2 days to flatten the curve messaging from years prior, saying they needed a different strategy now to create that chaos and obedience. And after the event, what was the perceived reaction from the governments involved? Anything surprising?
Yeah, quite surprising. The source perceived them as basically having a party about it, like pleased with the outcome, not concerned.
A party. Wow. So no plans to actually fix the vulnerability then?
The perception was they'd officially say they will find solutions, put on a show, but they do nothing about it. Why would they? According to the source, they created it.
Okay, let's talk technology. The source mentioned a specific tech involved, right?
Yes, HARP.
HARP. And how is HARP supposedly used here, especially if the power was out?
That's the thing. The source perceived that HARP frequencies were used during the blackout, even with the grid down. The idea was to use these frequencies to create more chaos on the people's brain, operating on that energetic level.
So the frequencies amplified the fear.
Exactly. Create more fear, collect more of that energy in the fishnet, and really push people to give up their own power. Look for help outside, not inside.
The timing, April 28th, was also seen as significant, wasn't it? Why that specific date?
Yeah, the perception linked it to planets aligning, to astrology. The number 28 itself came up as being a powerful number in this context.
And wasn't there another timing link, something about the Pope?
Right. It happened 7 days after Pope, implying a recent death or major event involving the Pope. And the number 7 was also flagged as powerful.
So why link the blackout timing to that Pope event? What was the perceived reasoning?
To keep the energy harvesting going, essentially, keep people distracted. The source suggested that focusing people on big external events distracts them from their own lives, their own power. It creates ongoing uncertainty like a domino effect. First, the Pope event, then the blackout. Makes people anxious, wondering what's next.
Okay, so looking forward from that point, early May 2025 in the source's timeline. What were the perceived future implications of this blackout?
Well, more fear, obviously, the feeling that this could definitely happen again, and just a lingering sense of helplessness, uselessness among the people who went through it.
But it wasn't all negative, was it? The source mentioned a kind of dual outcome.
Exactly, like two blades cutting both ways.
Okay, what were the two blades?
So blade 1 is the intended negative outcome, chaos and fear. But blade 2 is the unintended positive, people becoming more aware, more awakened, and crucially, more prepared, learning to be more self-reliable.
Self-reliable. Did the source mention practical ways people might do that?
Yeah, simple things. Realizing you need cash on hand, people trying to pull up the money off their banks because, cards and digital stuff are useless in a blackout. Basic preparedness.
And did the source perceive more blackouts coming in the future? Globally, maybe?
Yes, absolutely. This was seen as just a little simulation. The perception was they will try to do it again.
But would future attempts be as effective?
The source perceived that they won't have the outcome they want next time because people will be more in control of themselves. Though it noted this was maybe 50-50 at that point. A growing resistance. And it wasn't just blackouts perceived for the future, right?
No, the source indicated something else was planned, using things that would be framed as natural causes, but which are perceived as not natural at all.
To give an example. Yes, later on, floods were mentioned specifically as the government's perceived next action, using natural disasters.
Were any specific places or times mentioned for future blackouts?
Few, yeah. Italy was mentioned, with dates like 30 and 28 after maybe days of the month. Canada was perceived for August 28, 2025. And some U.S. states, specifically ones with Republican governors, were mentioned, but no date for those. But despite these pretty grim future perceptions, there was that positive thread about people's response.
Definitely. The core perception was that people will try to become more self-reliable, learn to be more independent, less hooked on tech and gadgets, learn to be okay without it, figure out ways to cope.
And the governments wouldn't be able to stop future ones.
Nope. The source reiterated the perception that they can't prevent them because in this view, they created it in the first place. They wouldn't stop their own plan.
Okay, so if we try to boil this whole deep dive down, what's the core message takeaway from this really unusual source material?
The main thrust, the central message perceived, is that people really need to focus inwards, focus on themselves, on their own intuition.
As opposed to just reacting to external stuff. Exactly. The advice was basically not to believe anything they hear from the outside. Instead, listen to their own instinct. Trust that inner voice.
And the fact this information even came out through the regression.
That itself was perceived as something being allowed,
Yeah.
Allowed for the benefit of human consciousness. A kind of wake-up call.
Yeah.
So, this deep dive took us through a really unique lens on a reported event. We touched on perceived, physical causes, this idea of energetic harvesting by certain entities, complex global politics, how people reacted differently depending on where they were, even specific tech like HARP and astrological timing.
Right. We went from push buttons and energy fishnets to government parties and planetary alignments, citywide panic versus quiet candle buying in the suburbs. It's a really intricate narrative full of unexpected links, all coming from this one specific source, this hypnotic regression.
And we've really tried to just lay out the information as it was presented in that transcript, neutrally, giving you a clear look at this particular viewpoint, this narrative it constructs.
It definitely gives you a lot to think about, doesn't it? Just how differently events can be perceived and interpreted depending on the framework you're using.
It really does. And maybe that leads to the final question for you, listening right now. Given that this source ends with such a strong emphasis on focusing inwards, on trusting your own instinct, especially when faced with all these competing stories and potential uncertainty, how does hearing that perspective make you think about navigating the world and all the information swirling around out there?
That's a powerful thought to end on. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.
Yeah, we really hope this exploration, looking closely at this unique source, has given you some valuable stuff to mull over.